Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 1 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Nashville Predators, which the Sharks have lost 4-1. It was supposed to be a new season for San Jose, leave 21-22 in the past, bring in 22-23, new head coach, new general manager, multiple new faces, and yet we got more of the same here from the San Jose Sharks. It feels like nothing has really changed from last season. The number one problem for the Sharks last year was the fact that their offense was just not there, and the number one problem seemingly, of course it's still early on, for the San Jose Sharks this season is that the offense is just not really there. To first discuss how this game actually went, the Predators would get the scoring started pretty early on in the first period. Sherwood would score to make it 1-0, but the Sharks would get the game-tying goal from a Tomas Hertl attempt just after a power play expired. A nice little pass from newcomer Luke Cunnin, and the Sharks managed to tie that game on at 1. However, in the second period, things kind of got away from them. The Predators would just add 2 goals for themselves to make it 3-1, and honestly, the Sharks never really challenged the Predators and UC Saros with that many fantastic opportunities, and they kind of just bowed out in this game with the Matt Duchene empty netter to top it off to lose this one 4-1. But the major thing that I want to talk about here is the lineup that David Quinn and the San Jose Sharks decided to go into this game with. If we take a look at the lineup that the Sharks had last season, we know that it had issues scoring. And then we take a look at the lineup coming into this particular game. How much has actually really changed for the better for the San Jose Sharks? I mean, we have to obviously note that Barabanov is injured, but we take a look at this first line of Meyer, Hertl, and Cunnin. Is that better than what the Sharks were icing last year of Meyer, Hertl, and Barabanov? Maybe it's even if they're lucky. The second line of Lindblom, Couture, and LeBanc, is that necessarily better than what some of the Sharks' second lines that they were icing last year that featured players like Dahlin or Balcers? I'm not entirely sure. Lindblom only ended up playing 9 or so minutes tonight. I don't exactly know the reason for that, but he didn't necessarily impress me all that much. And while LeBanc was pretty decent, I don't think it's necessarily all that much better. The third line for the San Jose Sharks is pretty much identical to what they ran at times last season with Gregor, Bonino, and Nieto. And then while the fourth line is different, and I would say better than many of the fourth lines the Sharks had last season that were featuring players like Weatherby or Lane Peterson, as the Sharks are now holding Lorentz, Sturm, and Gadjevich, it's still a fourth line. How much is that really going to contribute here for the San Jose Sharks? Any slight positives that the fourth line is bringing over last year's fourth line is pretty much outweighed by the fact that the Sharks lost Brent Burns, who was a really big part of their offense. And so I take a look at the roster of this season, and it's literally just objectively worse than the roster that they were icing last season. Now you could say, well then where was the hope coming into this year? And the hope relied on a couple of the Sharks rookies who were kind of a wild card at that point. You know, if you had inserted a player like William Eklund into the lineup, maybe he could really help top up that top 6. If you inserted player like Thomas Bordeleau into the top 6 or the top 9, maybe that adds an interesting offensive element to your lineup. But because David Quinn decided for whatever reason to not play these players, this lineup is essentially, I know exactly what I'm going to get from it, and exactly what I'm going to get from it is what we got here tonight with just a single goal against the Nashville Predators. And it's not as though the Predators just completely dominated San Jose. It's not as though they were just way outclassing San Jose and they had absolutely no chance. The Predators were okay in this game, but not really all that great. It's the Sharks who had the opportunities to make plays, but they just couldn't actually do it. And so that is why I have such a big issue with the Sharks benching their rookies, because then there is literally no ceiling to this roster capability-wise. And so unless David Quinn thought he was like the ultimate god of coaching and he would orchestrate this perfect offensive system that could get the offensively anemic San Jose Sharks players to be able to score enough goals to win games, he should have been going with the maybe slightly lower floor but higher ceiling type of players like Bordeleau, like Eklund, like Merkley, and maybe even players like Gushin, who had a fantastic preseason, into this lineup to try and spice things up, because otherwise, like I said, we're going to get more of the same things this season as we did last. Now, more specifically onto how these players actually played, the first line was obviously, as expected, the best line for the San Jose Sharks. Meyer and Hertl in particular, I thought had pretty pretty good games. But like I mentioned, the San Jose Sharks, if they're going to ice lineups like this, if they want to actually win games, Meyer and Hurdle have to be better than just pretty good. They have to be elite pretty much game in and game out. And because they weren't insanely amazing this game, they were just pretty good, the Sharks don't end up winning, and this line only manages the one goal of the night. On the second line, it was kind of odd. I mean, Couture and LeBanc and Lindblom as a unit had a couple of decent looks for themselves, but were pretty inconsistent throughout the game. And like I mentioned earlier, Lindblom played less than 10 minutes here tonight, and I don't exactly know the reasoning for that, but I guess we'll see how things go for tomorrow's game. If maybe it was a injury scare, because of course Lindblom was injured for much of the preseason, or if it was an actual performance-based type of benching situation, I'm not entirely sure. But I imagine this line will not be the same going into next game, though I can't say that for sure. On to the third line, it was Gregor, Bonino, and Matt Nieto, which was, as we saw many times last season, not very good. I actually decided to keep track of when this line would actually have their first shift of the game in the offensive zone, where they kept possession of the puck for more than a couple of seconds, and not on a shift where they literally started in the offensive zone. And it took until halfway through the second period before this line actually had an offensive zone shift. And really the only reason why it even happened halfway through the second is because the fourth line worked their way into the offensive zone and then slowly made changes to bring on these three players. Otherwise, they were playing in the defensive zone pretty much the entirety of this game. I believe it was like for the entire first period, they didn't even have a shot attempt while these three players were on the ice. So they couldn't even bring it into the offensive zone and try just a singular shot near the net. Doesn't even have to hit the net, just near the net to get their stats up in that particular way. This line was disastrous, and I know David Quinn wanted to go with a more defensive third line because that's clearly what the issue was for the San Jose Sharks. They weren't good enough defensively. The offense is there, but the defense not good enough, so they had to go two defensive players plus Noah Gregor. And it's exactly what we expect. Zero offense, and even the defense isn't that great, as we saw from Nick Bonino a lot last season. And then when it comes to the fourth line, like I mentioned earlier, it was a notable improvement from what we have seen at times last season, and that's really what a major targeting point for whatever reason for the San Jose Sharks was during this past offseason. The signing of Nico Sturm to a $2 million contract gave them a pretty decent and consistent fourth line center. It's just how much are you actually going to be able to get out of a fourth line that goes pretty well? Probably not much. I also was decently impressed by Lorentz's game here tonight. He was probably the player on the fourth line who looked the best, and we also saw him actually get shifts with the second line of Couture and LeBanc at times during this game, so we'll see what happens there. On the defensive side of things, another major issue, I complained pretty heavily about the fact that the Sharks did not bring Ryan Merkley to Europe for this set of games against the Nashville Predators, and we saw why. I mentioned earlier that the Sharks, there isn't a lot of offense here, but a lot of offense for NHL teams these days starts from the back end. And past Erik Karlsson, I mentioned this before, there is zero offense from the back end. On top of that, the Sharks only had two right-handed defensemen, and so the second unit here was icing two left-handers. And we saw early on in this game, it was Mario Ferraro being on his offside and multiple times forced to play the backhand on that right side of the ice. And that was actually the cause of multiple giveaways, including the first goal here scored by the Nashville Predators. It looked extremely awkward, so awkward in fact that it seems as though later on in the game, Ferraro and Vlasic actually swapped places and Vlasic was playing on his offside by the end of things. It's just so awkward when you have just two right-handed defensemen and then four left-handed defensemen in the lineup, because you're not as easily able to keep pucks in and you're not as easily able to get pucks out. On top of that, Erik Karlsson is the one guy atop the pile here for the San Jose Sharks, clearly the player who the Sharks need to carry the offensive load here from the back end. And who is he paired with in this situation? He is paired with Scott Harrington, a player who wasn't even a part of the San Jose Sharks plans a few weeks ago and was brought in on a tryout offer. And honestly, I don't think Harrington was terrible here tonight, besides the fact that he was on the first pairing and as such forced to play against players who are significantly better than him and he should never really be playing against. I mean, late in this first period, we saw Scott Harrington give up the puck, which led to an extremely good chance for Nashville Predators' best forward on their team, more or less, Philip Forsberg. And that was a turnover that if Ryan Merkley were to make that play, he probably wouldn't see the ice for the rest of the game. And yet Scott Harrington was right there at the start of the second period, first shift on the ice. There he is with Erik Karlsson at his side. For whatever reason, Harrington were able to forgive his major mistakes. But when it comes to a younger player, no, that guy doesn't even get to touch the ice because he might give the puck away. And so it's a situation where I mentioned this earlier, the Shark defense is not good on paper, and we saw here tonight that even though it was not a terrible game defensively as an effort, there wasn't really much north to south play that they could actually do from the back end because none of these players besides Karlsson are really puck-moving defensemen. And then finally, when it comes to the goaltender, James Reimer, who clearly is going to be asked of a lot this season, him and Kakkonen, to try and get wins for the San Jose Sharks since there likely isn't to be too much offense going on. He had a game that was pretty good, but not all that great. The two goals that were scored by the Predators in the second period, Tolvanen and Niederreiter, were both off of rush chances. Very good shots by these two players, but maybe you're hoping Reimer can make at least one of those saves, though even if he does make one of them, the Sharks still do not win. And on the first goal for Sherwood, I wouldn't say he had that much of a chance, so it was an okay game for Reimer, but not anything amazing. That will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow against the Nashville Predators again, and we'll see if they manage to actually put up a better performance or if hopefully they actually change up their lineup so that we can get something that isn't just a rehash of last season. Class dismissed.